But there's three websites that I like, or two websites that I really like, and this projector's cutting it off quite a bit. The first one is North Carolina State University. They have a great turfgrass and weed identification characteristic or website. So it's pretty cool. You know, you look at the blade. Or do we have a nice thin blade? Is it a grassy weed or grassy type plant? Is it a sedge? Do we have a triangular stem? So basically we can narrow it down to grasses and broadleaf weeds. We'll say, okay, it's a linear leaf. Click on that. And then what you can do is go, if you can't see what the vernation is, and we haven't talked about vernation yet, but for those of you who do that know what vernation is, you can click on certain things. Oh, well, it's folded. And then hopefully on the right-hand side, we'll start to see some of the grasses disappear. Oh, it's got a fringe of hairs, or we see some hairs on it. And we'll see even more hairs or more grasses disappear. Now we're left with what? 1, 2, 3, 4 grasses that we can choose from. We can narrow it down if we find some other information on here. But let's just take a look. Then we can look at Bermuda grass. Gives you some descriptions here. Talks about some details. And then give you some nice photographs of the grass and or weed. And they'll pop up. Doesn't work very well on my computer if I zoom it out. So there's a Bermuda grass seed head. Okay, so it's a nice decision aid tool, I think, that you can use. The other website is Purdue University, which there's the URL, but just search for Purdue Turfgrass. And down here in the middle, Turfgrass Tools is Turfgrass Identification. And that brings you to this page. And then they got some articles on how to identify some turfgrass, what's the different anatomy and morphology and things like that. Then if you click on the turfgrass identification section, instead of having cartoon pictures, they got a lot of photographs of the different parts of the grass plant. So, is the vernation rolled or folded? So you click rolled, folded, or I don't know. Well, let's go with I don't know. All right, so, or I guess maybe that means rolled and folded. That doesn't mean I don't know. So we'll click on rolled. Now it gives us a list of grasses over here on the right-hand side that are possibly folded or rolled. Let's see. It's got doesn't have a ligule. We can't see one. So you just keep working your way through this. Oh, it's got long clasping auricles. Still doesn't give us a good answer. It's got a boat-shaped leaf tip. This isn't working as well as it should be. So I see. It gives you percentages of what it thinks the grass probably could be. A boat-shaped leaf tip would not be found on annual ryegrass, so maybe we're seeing something we're not really seeing at. But 75% of the characteristics we chose, it thinks that it's annual ryegrass. Then I think we can come over and click on it, read more about annual ryegrass, see some nice pictures, and obviously you can see they got some really nice close-up pictures of the different parts of the grass. So that's Purdue. So North Carolina State and Purdue are two of my favorite Turf ID websites. Okay? Any questions about that? All right, let's go into my presentation here. So in that book and other turfgrass books, you'll see this picture, and we talked a little bit in the weed class about the growth of grass, how all the growth of the grass happens here at the base of the plant. The new cell division, cell elongation happens here, and it pushes up. Why is that important? Is when grass grows, the oldest grass blade on this plant is down here on the bottom. This is the oldest. Here's the next youngest. Here's the next youngest up here. And inside the stem, wrapped up inside the stem, are the newest, youngest leaves of that grass plant coming up from the bottom. Coming from the bottom and push out to the top. So that is how those leaves are arranged in the stem is vernation. And I'll show you some pictures of vernation here in a second. But that's why we need to know how these leaves are arranged inside the stem. We're going to go through the stolons here, but stolons, again, are above ground spreading structures, and rhizomes are below ground spreading structures. So you see, this is called the leaf blade, and I got a photograph that'll show this in a real grass plant here in a second. And then this would be the leaf stem, or the leaf sheath. So where the leaf blade meets the sheath, there's a lot of identification characteristics there. You can see them all over here. There's collars, auricles, ligules, sheath margins. I usually don't get involved at looking at those characteristics very often. I can identify just about every grass on that table without having to look at the auricles or the ligules or the collar on that so much. So with that, this is kind of how I want you guys to think about the process in your mind when you're trying to identify grasses. The first thing I'd like you to do is look for hairs. If you see hairs on the grass, 99% of the time, it's a warm season grass. And this time of the year, you can't see hairs on these grasses. So the other thing would be is look at the grass and think about what time of year it is. If it's January, February, March, and the grass is completely brown, it's probably a warm season grass. Or if it's got hairs in the middle of the summertime, it's probably a warm season grass. If it's February, March, April, and the grass is completely green, probably a cool season grass. So if it's got hairs, it's warm season grass. If it doesn't have hairs, it's probably a cool season grass, or you didn't see the hairs, and it's a warm season grass. But most warm season grasses have hair on them somewhere. The next thing I want you to do is look at the growth habit. And we'll explain stolons, rhizomes again here in a second. But I can't stress that enough. You guys probably all have knives in the back of your truck for cutting open your bags, right? But you need to have a knife to get in and cut the grass out. You know, as you get going and have more experience, you might be able to identify a lot of the grasses without even having to cut them open. You can just take a look from the top and go, okay, I can see that's perennial ryegrass, or I can see that's tall fescue. But in the meantime, even now, I always like to cut a plug. And you can see the size of some of these plugs over here. They're good 3 inches in diameter, got good 2 inches of soil with them. If I cut this out of somebody, I probably wouldn't do this in their front yard, but on the side yard, cut this out, take a look at this sample, put it back in the ground, press it back in, it'll have a pretty good chance of surviving. Unless it's the middle of July, then we'd have to keep it a little bit damp. But cut big plugs, and you can take them apart, take a look at it, and put it back. So we can look at these spreading structures, because rhizomes are under the ground, and you're not going to see them unless you cut them out. Then the last thing I want you to look at is vernation. So let's go through some of these things. So growth habit, stolons, rhizomes. So a grass can have stolons, a grass can have rhizomes, a grass can have both stolons and rhizomes, or a grass can have neither. And I've got some of my slides out of order, so let me jump ahead. All grasses will produce tillers. So tall fescue. Grab the tall fescue plant here. So a tiller is basically a daughter plant that spreads out from beside itself. So all grasses produce tillers. Tough. So this is a group of tall fescue plants. This is probably the first plant here that germinated from seed in the middle, and then all of these are tillers that grew up beside that plant. So that's the only way tall fescue will spread out, is by tillering. So you can imagine it would take forever for a tall fescue plant to spread out across the yard compared to something that has rhizomes or stolons like Kentucky bluegrass has rhizomes, and this is a stolon for Bermuda grass. So these above ground spreading structures we already talked about when we did the ID over there, how each one of these spots is a spot for a new plant to grow where new roots can come out. Okay, so fescue does not have any spreading structures where bluegrass has rhizomes and other grasses have stolons. So let's jump back where we were here. So growth habit, vernation. So like I said, we're looking at how are these leaves arranged in the stem. And if you looked at that orchard grass over there, very flat, very folded, easy to see that it was a nice folded vernation. Kentucky bluegrass has a folded vernation, but it's such a small stem you can't just roll it in your hand. You gotta peel it open and take a look at whether it's rolled or folded in there. And then tall fescue would be an example of a rolled grass. This is the picture of what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about the leaf blade and the sheath. So here's the leaf blade or leaf sheath. Here's the leaf blade, and then this area here where the blade and the sheath meet. That's where you're gonna have the collar on the back side. The ligule will be inside here, and then the auricles will be wrapping around the front. But like I said, we're not too worried about auricles and such. So, stolons, spread out, rhizomes underneath the ground. Stolons, since they're on top of the ground, let me go back. This one's showing them they got a little bit of red color. They can be a little bit of red, a little bit of green because they're on top of the ground. They can absorb some sunlight and do some photosynthesis. Rhizomes, on the other hand, are under the ground. They're usually white. They're usually or brown color. They're not. They don't have any color, green color in them because they're under the ground. You kind of see the difference between the roots and the rhizome there. The roots very thin like hair, and rhizomes closer to the thickness of the lead of a pencil or a pen, a ballpoint pen type thickness. So we talked about thatch over there, but let me reiterate it again. So thatch is made up mostly of stem tissue. So the stem tissue of rhizomes, root or stem tissue of stolons, and just the stem tissue of the plant itself. Grass clippings usually break down relatively quickly, and so they don't cause a thatch problem. It doesn't mean we don't get thatch problems in tall fescue or other grasses like that. It can happen, but generally it's the stolons and the rhizomes. So bluegrass yards, we're going to have thatch more often. Zoysia grass is one exception to this rule. If you felt the zoysia grass over there, the grass blades are very stiff. They don't break down very easily, so we can have much more of a thatch problem in zoysia grass, and we've got to control that thatch problem. If you guys got anything you want to pipe up in the back about anytime, we don't have to just be me chat. What? All right, just toss it up. Yeah, okay. You can. Yep. Whenever you want to.
Cover all those grasses.
So, yeah.
A few years back, I went to one of your turf field days at K-State. You were doing research on your rhizomatous tall fescue.
Okay.
Whatever came of that?
That's a very good question. So the question about rhizomatous tall fescue. So we said fescue doesn't have rhizomes, right? The fine fescue has short rhizomes, but they have found some tall fescues growing out wild in nature that may produce some short rhizomes. So they tried to breed those fescues that were generally pretty unattractive looking fescues and try to crossbreed them with turf type tall fescues to get spreading tall fescues, which would be fantastic. It would be awesome. It would be like bluegrass that spreads. We did some research at K-State, took plots of rhizomatous tall fescue, took plots of K31 tall fescue and plots of turf type tall fescue and plots of Kentucky bluegrass and cut holes in the middle of them, took a big plug out of it and measured how fast those areas filled back in. The Kentucky bluegrass, in 2 years it was all filled back in. You couldn't even see that there was a hole there. In all three of the other fescues, the rhizomatous tall fescue, the K31, and the turf type tall fescue, same growth. There was still a hole there. It slowly filled in because it does tiller. They do tiller, so it slowly filled in. It wasn't as big as it was when we started, but it didn't fill in at all. So those plugs that we took out of those plots, we took to a bare soil situation and put those plugs in the ground and tried to see how fast those plugs spread out. And then we never did see any rhizomes growing in those either. The few times I would get down and look at the plugs and measure, so my job was to measure the diameter of the plug a couple different ways and look for rhizomes. It's a fun, tedious job, but every once in a while, probably like 2 or 3 times, I saw a rhizome sticking out about 2 inches from the side of that plug, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. And rhizomatous turf type tall fescue. Then I get down, I'd pull it out, or look real close before I pull it out, and it had a folded vernation and a boat-shaped leaf tip. So there was bluegrass in that rhizomatous tall fescue. Whether that was contamination from us when we planted the stuff, we didn't get a good kill of that area when we reseeded into an old area, or whether it was in the seed, I have no idea, but there was some bluegrass in it, so I pulled that out and move on. But no, they didn't spread out at all. So rhizomatous tall fescues, they don't seem to spread in the field situation. In a greenhouse, in a sand pot, they can get some short rhizomes, but not in a field situation. Now, what we didn't do at K-State, and I haven't seen anybody do yet, is traffic tolerance or drought tolerance. So maybe the rhizomes are just so short that they don't spread, but maybe they increase some traffic tolerance or drought tolerance. I don't know, but right now I don't think it's worth paying that premium for the rhizomatous tall fescue. Okay.
How are you seeing bluegrass spread normal, not the past 3 years? Normal, Mother Nature only watering on a strong fertilizer program like ours. I have seen it where there's not a hole like you were talking about from a plug head. In a residential lawn, you got a dead spot or a dog will eat it or whatever. Fist size and smaller will fill in. I've seen on our fertilizer program.
In one season, absolutely, yeah. Fist size or smaller will fill in Kentucky bluegrass.
Fist size, it usually doesn't. For whatever reason, it's too hot in that spot.
Right.
Sunlight. That's
right.
what I've seen. Have you seen similar?
Yep. And then I'll tell you, when we had the plugs, I had a 4-inch diameter plug of Kentucky bluegrass, and after 2 years of, I wouldn't say aggressive watering because it was out at my place and I didn't have good water out at the Olathe Center, so very limited watering and average fertilizer. We weren't doing as much fertilizer as we do here. It spread out to a 2-foot diameter circle in 2 years, so that's a pretty big spread there. So Kentucky bluegrass can spread out quite a bit.
Fairly aggressive.
Yep. Yep. All right. So one of the other distinguishing characteristics we're going to get into when we talk about the bluegrasses is the leaf tip. So bluegrasses have a boat-shaped leaf tip, and that's not a very good picture. I like this picture a little bit better, and I'll show you a photograph of it. But basically, when we look, if we get down and look at the Kentucky bluegrass leaf tips, they come up to what looks like the keel of a boat. If we look at tall fescue leaf tips, it's just flat. The blade comes up and goes to a flat. Look at it from the side, it's straight and pointed. But Kentucky bluegrass, it folds up to a keel of a boat, and if we slide our fingers out the end, it'll form this notch shape like we see here on the screen. TJ was telling me, and I haven't done this a whole lot, he said every once in a while he'll find perennial ryegrass with a boat-shaped leaf tip on it, but if you run your finger out it doesn't split open like this, and I didn't try it on the boat-shaped leaf tip that you found over there, but that might have been Kentucky bluegrass in there as well. So the problem with using boat-shaped leaf tips or leaf tips in general is what? What's that?
You could misidentify bluegrass, or
You could misidentify it, but what would be the issue with trying to find a leaf tip? We mow it. So I didn't mean to get you too confused, but we mow the grass, and so you got to get down low to the ground and look for the leaf tips. We're going to look for them in the new shoots that are coming out if you want to look for those boat-shaped leaf tips. The other thing is what you're getting at more is that the boat-shaped leaf tip is an indicator of all bluegrasses. So there's rough bluegrass, Poa trivialis, there's annual bluegrass, there's Kentucky bluegrass. I don't think anybody's growing Canadian bluegrass around here, but we had Canadian bluegrass in Iowa. It didn't grow very well, but there's a lot of bluegrasses out in the world, and boat-shaped leaf tip is an indicator of all of them. We get down into places where there's St. Augustine grass, it kind of has a boat-shaped leaf tip as well. So boat-shaped leaf tip isn't the end-all, be-all. The way I use it is I'll look at grass, I'll look at the grass, it's got thin blades, it doesn't have any hairs, it's green in the springtime, it's got a folded vernation. I found some rhizomes, and that sounds like Kentucky bluegrass to me. Sounds like everything is Kentucky bluegrass. I find that boat-shaped leaf tip, now I'm positive that it's Kentucky bluegrass. Does that make sense? Okay. So the collar, let me grab a collar off the tall fescue here if I can find one. So again, what we're looking at as we peel this leaf blade open is where this leaf meets the sheath. And on the back side of it, it's kind of a lime green color. Even on the inside, we can kind of see it's got a little bit of a lime green color to it. So where the blade meets the sheath, you can see a nice line there. That's the collar region that they're talking about on that slide there. You can see a little lime green line on the back. Again, I don't use collars for a lot of identification characters to that lime green, but just so you know what it is when we're talking about this lime green area with the blade meets the sheath. That's the collar. Blade, sheath. It's hard to see on that. You can see on this one here. Okay. Nice big broad collar of this lime green area with this sheath and blade. You can see it on the back side. Here. Collar. Right there. Lime green. Transition. So that's also at the collar region. That's where a lot of some of the cell division happens as well. So as we cut this blade off, this blade got cut off here. New cells are going to continue to divide from this collar region and push that blade up from the bottom, kind of like we talked about with the Play-Doh and stuff like that, pushing it up from the bottom. That's why we can mow grass. So ligules, that's the ligule. Again, if it's hairs in the middle there, it's warm season grass. If it's not, it's going to be a membranous ligule or it's going to be nothing else. That's all right. Anyway, so let's move on. Oracles, growth of warm season or growth of grasses. Yeah, I'm going to wait. I can't compete with that.
no, it's not.
You don't have to deal with that enough either.
So, cool season grasses. We've seen this type of growth chart before. They grow really well in the springtime, really well in the fall, not so well in the summertime when it gets hot and dry. Warm season grasses is just the opposite. When it gets too hot, too dry, the warm season grasses can go dormant as well. The problem is that we're here in the transition zone, so it's difficult to grow either one. So let's move on and talk about the individual grasses. So the bluegrasses, the ones with the boat-shaped leaf tip. Kentucky bluegrass, annual ryegrass, and Poa trivialis. So Kentucky bluegrass, and I'm going to keep trying to go back and forth, giving you the characteristics between so you can compare them. So Kentucky bluegrass has a folded vernation and rhizomes and has that boat-shaped leaf tip. Tall fescue, we're going to see in a minute, has rolled and is a bunch-type grass. It has a pointed leaf tip. Okay, so that's how you can distinguish those two. So rhizomes and the vernation being different between those two grasses. And then if we're looking at Poa trivialis, it's going to have stolons instead of having the rhizomes. And we'll talk more about that in a second.
Does all the bluegrass have a strong midrib too?
Yeah.
I didn't see that.
Right, yeah, and it's on this picture here.
Okay.
So all the bluegrasses have a strong midrib. I keep forgetting about that. I usually don't. Right. I don't look at it, but I've been doing it long enough. So what he's talking about is if we look at this fescue leaves, and we'll show some photographs of the fescue in here in a little bit, there isn't really a midrib in the middle. The leaf is the same shape all the way across. Lots of grooves, but no main rib down the middle of the leaf. If we were to get a Kentucky bluegrass leaf out, you can see where we have this main rib, and sometimes some people will hold that up to the light, and they'll see two kind of translucent sides to it. It's hard to do, but it definitely has a midrib where the fescue does not. Thank you. So, fine bladed grass, much slower to germinate. I mean, we can get it to germinate in 7 to 8 days, but generally it's closer to that 10-day range because it's slower to germinate. If you're reading books or you hear people talk about, say, well, Kentucky bluegrass has less heat tolerance than tall fescue. Let me explain what the difference is or what's happened here. Tall fescue has a deeper root system than Kentucky bluegrass, generally speaking. So it has more soil that it can draw moisture from, where Kentucky bluegrass has the shorter root zone, and this is just, figuratively speaking, not exactly. But so Kentucky bluegrass has a shorter root zone, tall fescue has a deeper root zone. So comparing those 2 yards, as we go into the summertime without irrigation, the tall fescue has much more soil that it can draw moisture from, and so it'll stay greener longer as we get into the heat and the drought, where the bluegrass will go dormant quicker. So that's where they're talking about less heat tolerance. So what happens after that is that the Kentucky bluegrass has the rhizomes underneath the ground. So once they're both brown and completely dormant, the Kentucky bluegrass can actually survive the drought longer because of those rhizomes. So don't let people say, people don't talk about, or how do you want to say it? Some people say, oh, that bluegrass, it takes so much water. Well, yes, if you want to keep it green, it's going to take a little bit more water because it has a shorter root zone than tall fescue. So if you want to keep it green, it's going to take more water. If you want it to survive without water, it'll actually survive without water better than tall fescue will. And then when you look at studies out of like San Antonio, where they have in their water restrictions, water guidelines for new homes, they have any plant material that goes in a new home in San Antonio has to last 60 days without water. And Kentucky bluegrass makes the list. It turns brown, but it'll survive 60 days without water and come back to life. So that's a positive thing with those rhizomes. It's not always, it's not always green. Not necessarily what our homeowners want, but
Is that like the sod will live 60 days?
the established plant.
Or the established?
Yeah. Sorry, not
Like the
yeah,
sod?
not 60 days. Throw a sod down. Yeah.
If that's the case, why are we watering up here? Then it's not-
Right. So,
Go for it.
not the sod, but the established grass. Yep. Okay. All right. So Kentucky bluegrass, here's the close-up picture again. You can kind of see that boat-shaped leaf tip up there. It's hard to see the folded vernation, but you can kind of see the size of the seed and how flat and compressed. You can see the folded vernation here as well. So Poa trivialis, rough bluegrass. This is kind of a picture of what it looks like when it dies. I got a slide later, but I'm gonna talk about it because I'm thinking about it. So Poa trivialis, when it dies, can be confused with grub damage, and that's what a lot of people will talk about. Is, oh, I got grubs. The difference when Poa trivialis dies compared to grub damage is going to be that. Let's see if I can do it over here without making too big of a mess. This isn't my shop. It's not my problem. No. So when Poa trivialis dies, you're going to be able to rip up and just get the grass in your hand, right? And only the soil will stay in place. Where when you have grub damage, I got a nice thin one here. No, but in general, when you have grub damage, you'll peel it open and you'll get the sod that comes with it. The grass, the soil comes with it. Okay, so grub damage, because the grubs eat all the roots off, and so it peels back like carpet. It peels back like a rug. Where Poa trivialis, the top of it dies, and you're just pulling the dead grass material off the soil. Okay, so that's going to be the big distinguishing characteristic between Poa trivialis death and grub damage, and the presence of Poa trivialis. You know, if you peel it open or grab it and you see all these stolons in there, dead stolons, brown stolons, probably Poa trivialis. The other grass that Poa trivialis can be confused with is going to be creeping bent grass. I don't see a lot of it around, and I haven't been on all of our routes yet, but it's around, and it is a stoloniferous grass like Poa trivialis. Generally a little bit lighter green color, but creeping bent grass, we'll see in a minute, has a rolled vernation and a big membranous ligule, where this says Poa trivialis has a folded vernation and that boat-shaped leaf tip. Both stoloniferous grasses, but those are the differences. Okay? So, cool season, stoloniferous grass, folded vernation, everything we said. Somebody else brought up, when you're running your hand across an area that has fescue and stoloniferous, or fescue and Poa trivialis in it, that your hand can kind of slide across the fescue really easily, and it kind of sticks a little bit more. The Poa trivialis, a little bit softer, kind of a stickier feel. I've noticed that every once in a while. It's not a very good indication or ID term, but something to think about.
It's always a huge color difference too if you're dealing with fescue.
Big color difference, much lighter grayish green color, bluish color rather than the dark green in the fescue. So again, here you see the stolon of the rough bluegrass. Sometimes as the rough bluegrass matures, that sheath, the leaf sheath, will turn into some type of an onion skin looking appearance. So it kind of gets kind of translucent, kind of papery. It's hard to see that all the time too, but it's one of the characteristics of it as well. Often we're seeing it as a contaminant in our turfgrass seed that we're buying. Not that we're buying, that what other people buy. We try not to buy contaminated seed. But when you're talking to people about seed, when you're reading the seed label, that it'll say something like 0.01% other crop seed. They don't tell you what that other crop seed is, but it could be rough bluegrass. It could be rough bluegrass and a couple other things. But if it was completely rough bluegrass, that 0.1% seed, rough bluegrass seed, ends up to be about 2,500 rough bluegrass seeds per pound. And if we're seeding a bluegrass yard, a pretty heavy rate or 3-pound rate, that is a lot of seeds per square foot, 7 to 8 seeds per square foot. And if it was tall fescue seeding rate at 8 to 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet, you can imagine we're going to have 20 to 30 seeds of Poa trivialis per square foot from just a 0.1% contamination. So it doesn't take a lot to cause some problems. So that's why we buy quality seed, and that's why you should have your homeowners buy from us or have us seed it for them.
Also, one of those other things when you are seeding, if you seed POA in, you do it at the end, after you've done everything else, and you take a hand spreader and do it that way. Don't put it in your spreader, don't cut it with a verticutter.
All right. So you're saying if we were going to be seeding Poa trivialis on purpose, use a hand spreader and don't run through our spreader. That way we're not getting contamination on that spreader. We take it to the next property and don't use it. Don't verticut on top of it, because then we get Poa trivialis seed in our verticutter and take it to another property and cause some contamination. Very good points. Very good points. There's something else I just thought of. Walk backwards out of it.
Yeah.
Don't touch anything. There was something else. Poa trivialis seed. It escapes me at the moment. Yeah, had some good points, and there's something I thought of while I was doing that. Let's see, seed. I know Oh, TJ brought it up.
Kill it in the spring.
Kill it in the spring. We're gonna get to that, I guess. We talked about insect damage and disease damage. Very matty, very spongy growth habit. The only really way to kill Poa trivialis is to kill it in the springtime. If we try to kill it in the summertime, it's already brown, already dead, dormant, damaged, whatever, and it's not going to absorb that herbicide. So we want to kill it in the springtime. Man, it's right on the tip of my forehead. I can't remember what it was. It seemed very important. Now I forgot it. So Roundup in the springtime as early as possible. I don't even know how early we're going out with Roundup. How early are we trying to go out with Roundup and kill it? You guys tell me. March. Yeah. Spray it one time or twice. And it's got to be growing. I mean, if it's cold March, then we got to wait to make sure it's actively growing. So it was about seed. Man, it's gonna bother me for the rest of the presentation. But anyway, that's enough about rough bluegrass. So annual bluegrass, same type of boat-shaped leaf tip as all the bluegrasses. It's got a great big membranous ligule, but it is a very small plant. I think just the seed itself. This is the seed before it's fully emerged. It usually comes out and forms more of a panicle style seed head. Very light grayish-green color. The seed is almost white or very light green color, so it sticks out like a sore thumb. Grows in mostly shady, wet areas, but it can grow in any area. Pretty easy to see, I think, when you see it. Any other questions about annual bluegrass before we move on? Or statements?
Does it usually grow like in a patch, usually? Kind of a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be usually a bare soil situation, and then you'll have just a whole bunch of annual bluegrass filling that bare spot. Yep.
Between bricks.
Pardon me?
Between bricks.
Between breaks? Bricks. Okay, yeah. All right, sure. Anywhere where there's a bare spot and some moisture, it'll thrive. Okay, so the fescues, we talked a little bit about the differences between turf type tall fescue and fine fescue. That really, if people are asking you for fine fescues, they're probably asking you for the turf type tall fescue and not these group of fine fescues, the creeping red or the chewings or the hard. Generally, the research I've seen out of Virginia, and they've done most of the research on the fine fescues, is that the hard fescues tend to do better in the transition zone like Virginia and Kansas. And I think that's what we're buying in our shade mix is a hard fescue. And that's what that grass over there on the quiz was a hard fescue. Not that you need to know too much of that, but you need to know that this one does better than the other ones. The tall fescue, Plastica runnenesia, we'll get to that in a second. So the creeping red fescue, hard fescue, they're all going to be the same. I can't identify them very much. But here's that on. The difference between creeping red fescue and hard fescue is very hard for me to do. I don't think I can do it. But so here's that on we were talking about. You see it breaks off on some of the seeds. You can kind of see this this leaf is rolled up on itself. That's one of the distinguishing characteristics of the fine fescues. If we look at Kentucky bluegrass or fescue leaves, it's a big flat blade. When it gets hot and dry, it'll fold over like that on itself, where the red fescues or the fine fescues in general will form more of a tube, and that's what gives it that needle-looking like appearance. It's not sharp like stab your hand needle with that round, very, very fine texture to that fine fescues. Okay. So if we were to peel it open, I've never peeled a fine fescue plant open. It's almost, I can pick it out without having to look at the vernation, but it does have a folded vernation if you wanted to get down with a hand lens and peel it open. It's usually a bunch type grass, but it may have some rhizomes, and we looked at that thatch layer on that hard fescue. There was a bunch of thatch layer. I don't think that whole thatch layer comes from the rhizomes of that fescue that is producing over there. That grass will actually melt out a couple times a year from red thread and a few other diseases, and the whole thing gets clobbered. And I think just the amount of growth and the death that happens there is causing that thatch layer. And not to mention, I haven't read any research about the fine fescues, but those leaves feel stiffer like zoysia grass leaves do, and I'm wondering if fine fescue leaves don't break down as quickly and as easily as tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass does. But there's a lot of thatch over there. So hard fescue, same type of appearance. Tall fescue. There we see what Josh was talking about. There isn't a midrib, a main rib on this leaf blade, although it kind of looks like with the shadow. But coarse veins all the way across the surface of the leaf. You can see here there isn't a midrib here. Coarse veins. There's that collar we were trying to show. I was trying to show you when we walked around. So you can see it on this side. And if we were turning it around, you can see the same thing. There may be a little ligule in there, but nah, not much. Pointed leaf tip, and then again, no rhizomes, no stolons on the tall fescue. Brown patch. You open up a book, look up brown patch. This is the kind of picture you're going to see. Usually, many of our yards we're seeding with bluegrass in them, and so if you add that bluegrass in there, you don't get to see these nice dinner plate pattern to it. It's more of a diffuse pattern. The key thing we need to do is get down and look for these lesions that are on the tall fescue leaves. So if we were doing a disease class, they show a disease triangle, right? They'd say, first you got to have the right host. So we got to make sure that there's tall fescue growing in that yard. So we got to get down on our hands and knees, look at the grass, look for the veins, look at the roll of vernation, and first determine that it's tall fescue. The other thing we want to determine is that it has the right environment. Is it May, June, July, or is it January? So if it's May, June, July, it's an opportunity time for brown patch to grow. And then look for the lesions on the leaf. And if we see the lesions, and we see those lesions on tall fescue, and it's during the right time of the year, it's probably brown patch. Okay, so you can't just look at brown grass or brown fescue and go, oh, it's brown patch. You got to be able to look at these lesions and put everything together. Okay. So we're not going to skip past some of this because we're running short on time. We talked, again, about the difference between K31 and the turf type tall fescue. K31, some people love it. Where'd he go? And there he is in the front row. I like K31. It has its use. I don't necessarily like it for an urban yard or my main yard that I'm going to use. It's too coarse and too scratchy to run barefooted through. So I'll recommend using a turf type tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass mix for that couple thousand square foot area that I'm going to use, I'm going to play in, and then if I got a large acreage, then I'll put K31 everywhere else, something where I want to look at, but not necessarily run through and play through. But if you get it seeded dense enough and you irrigate it right and fertilize it, you can make a decent K31 yard out of it as well. But I like turf type tall fescue and bluegrass mixed together for my own yard, I guess. Okay. So the bent grasses, we already talked a little bit about creeping bent grass. There's a whole bunch of bent grasses out there. Really, the one that we're going to have here in town is going to be creeping bent grass. There is some colonial bent grass, but I haven't seen it growing. I have it growing out at the research center. I had it, but not growing in town. So we'll talk a little bit about creeping bent grass. Rolled vernation. So remember, Kentucky bluegrass had the folded vernation. So rolled vernation, they're both going to have stolons, or not Kentucky bluegrass, Poa trivialis. Poa trivialis and creeping bent grass both have stolons, but Poa trivialis has folded vernation, and Kentucky bluegrass has rolled vernation. Boy, I've done this too many times this week. Let's start all over again. So Poa trivialis has folded vernation. Creeping bent grass has rolled vernation. Poa trivialis and creeping bent grass both have stolons. Creeping bent grass has the white, long membranous ligule. Bent grass is going to have the pointed leaf tip, and Poa trivialis is going to have the boat-shaped leaf tip. That was hard to do. Ryegrasses. Perennial ryegrass and annual ryegrass, or Italian ryegrass. So Italian or annual ryegrass has rolled vernation, so it's going to look like tall fescue. So rolled vernation, tall fescue, and annual ryegrass similar. The difference, annual ryegrass is going to have these long clasping auricles, and that's not a very good photo. It's not coming out very well on this presentation, but it's going to have those long clasping auricles that are going to wrap around the stem. It's generally going to be, it's going to be similar in color to K31, but I think it's more of an upright growth in the bunch. K31 kind of tends to more spread out a little bit and lay flat, and the veins aren't going to be near as prominent on the annual ryegrass. It's going to be more of a smooth blade. And the tall fescue leaves are going to have those ridges on top of it, more prominent ridges. So remember, we've got tall fescue and annual ryegrass. Tall fescue is bunch type, annual ryegrass is bunch type. Tall fescue is rolled, annual rye is rolled. Tall fescue doesn't have auricles, but the annual rye does have auricles, and then the veins and the not veins on annual rye. Okay. Let's jump ahead to perennial ryegrass. So perennial ryegrass is folded, and it's going to look somewhat similar to Kentucky bluegrass. They're both real fine bladed. Generally, I think the perennial ryegrasses are darker in green than the Kentucky bluegrasses. But so they're going to be folded. They're going to generally be a clump. So it's a bunch type grass because it doesn't have rhizomes or stolons. And once you see a clump of ryegrass, you'll start seeing them everywhere. Once you start to noticing them, they like to grow in nice little clumps. Unless you've seeded the whole yard with perennial ryegrass. But darker green color, doesn't have those big veins like tall fescue does. Has more of a, does it have a midrib?
Yeah.
Yeah? I don't even look at the midrib on perennial ryegrass. Thank you. Pointed leaf tip, the shiny backside too. When you see that, I mean, that sample is obviously dormant a little bit, but when you see it growing in the summer and you see that clump of ryegrass and you kind of look at it in the right way in the sunlight, it definitely looks shinier than Kentucky bluegrass or tall fescue, and I think that's a good indication as well. And usually, like I said, it is usually the darkest grass, one of the darkest grasses in the landscape. All right, we'll wrap them up again. We'll have a summary slide comparing all the grasses in a minute. So let's talk about the warm season grasses: Bermuda, zoysia grass, and buffalo grass. Those are the big three we're going to have around here. You get down into Oklahoma, might have some other things, but in this part of Kansas and Missouri, these are the big three. Generally, if we have Bermuda grass growing in the Kansas City area, it's a common type. And I like to say the common Bermudas don't have manners. They have very aggressive stolons and very aggressive rhizomes, and they'll spread out all over, and they produce a lot of seed. And the seed on Bermuda grass is half the size or a quarter of the size of that bluegrass seed over there. It's very, very small, so it can blow around and get all over in lots of things. When we get south of Emporia, a couple hours south of the Kansas City area, we move into Wichita and stuff. Then we'll start having some of the hybrid varieties. The Riviera is a seeded type. Patriot is a vegetative type. Those grasses have much denser growth habit, darker green color, and usually the seed that they produce is sterile, so you don't have the seed issues. And they still have aggressive rhizomes and stolons, but they're not as aggressive. They don't spread the 2 feet; they'll spread 1.5 feet in a season instead of 2 feet or whatever. And you can see the internode length on the hybrids; they're much closer together than the common type. Folded vernation, again, I usually don't look at the vernation on Bermuda grass. It's so small, so hard to see, but it does have rhizomes and stolons. It's going to have that hairy ligule, which I think I got a picture here, that hairy ligule on here, but it does not have any hairs on the leaf surface. So just hairs where the leaf blade meets the leaf sheath. Hairs right there, leaf blade, leaf sheath. And then we talked about, let's see, can we see it in this photograph? Kind of how the creeping bentgrass leaves, or not creeping bentgrass, Bermuda grass leaves kind of go all the way up as a point like that, where the zoysia grass leaves sometimes are more shaped straight all the way up and then come to a point like that. So Bermuda grass and zoysia grass. And remember, and I'm doing this because I'm recording this at the same time, so I'm drawing some of the things I did before. So remember, we have the hairy ligule there on both of them, but the zoysia grass has a few hairs on the leaves where the Bermuda grass does not have any hairs on the leaves. Okay? Where were we? So, lookalikes. We talked about zoysia grass, right? Hairs on the leaves, very stiff to the touch. Zoysia grass has the rolled vernation. Bermuda grass has the folded, but like I said, I usually never peel them apart that far. It's too small to see, but if you wanted to, that's where you can look at. The next one that Bermuda grass can be confused with is nimblewill. So nimblewill has a stoloniferous grass. The seed heads are a little bit different. The seed head on Bermuda grass is more of a crow's foot style seed head. The seed head on nimblewill is more of a spike, like this, and each one of the seeds, remember we saw last week on the quiz, has the little hair coming out of it, the awn on the nimblewill. The other distinguishing characteristic of nimblewill and Bermuda grass is going to be that nimblewill has the membranous ligule and Bermuda grass has the hairy ligule. So if you go back all the way to the first slide of class, we said ID terms I want you to use. If it has hairs, it's a warm season grass. If it has no hairs, it's probably a cool season grass. Nimblewill has some hairs on it, but its ligule is a membranous ligule. Okay, so just because you see a membranous ligule does not equate cool season grasses.
Another really stupid way that I found that I can tell the difference right off the bat. Situational one is it growing in the shade. Two, you literally just rip it right out of the ground without any basically effort whatsoever. Usually it's
Okay. So Nimblewheel likes it in the shade.
Yep.
Bermuda grass doesn't grow as well in the shade. Nimblewheel, you can rip it right out of the ground, and Bermuda grass more attached to the ground. Good points. All right. We're going to skip past some of these things. Seeded types. If we're going to seed Bermuda, the Riviera is probably what I'm going to be recommending for this part of Kansas and Missouri. We'll have to look at different varieties. Definitely in Oklahoma, there's lots of different varieties we can use if we're going to be sodding or sprigging. So I didn't talk about sprigging. We'll talk a little briefly about it. So if we're trying to establish a Bermuda grass yard, we can buy Bermuda grass seed, Riviera, and we'd seed that at a different time of year than we seed cool season grasses. So Kentucky bluegrass, fescue, we're going to seed those in September, late August, early October. If we're going to seed Bermuda grass, we're going to seed it. Usually the magical date is June 1st, but anytime in mid to late May to mid-June is the magical time for seeding Bermuda grass. We've got to have nice warm soils. The other way we can do Bermuda grass, so we talked about the stolons, right, and the rhizomes, and how each one of these spots is a growing point. Well, we can take Bermuda grass sod, shred it up into pieces, and spread out those pieces on the ground, and that's called sprigging. So they'll take all these pieces, shred them up, put them out on the ground, roll them in, fertilize them and water them, and you'll have a nice bluegrass area or Bermuda grass area, lickety split, usually about 6 weeks, and you have a nice Bermuda grass yard from sprigging. Okay, pretty nice way to establish it. Somebody was asking about sprigging of buffalo grass. They're doing some research at the University of Nebraska. They haven't got all the kinks worked out on how to sprig buffalo grass yet. There's some issues on when to harvest them and how to plant them. So if they do that, that might be a better way to establish buffalo grass yards than doing buffalo grass seed. We haven't got to the buffalo grass slide yet, but buffalo grass seed is hard to get it to germinate. It takes a long time and it's slow and not any fun. So that's how you sprig. Okay. So for these vegetative varieties, Patriot, Midfield, Midlawn, Mid-Iron, those type of things, you cannot get seed with those, so you have to sprig them or buy sod. And so the benefit of sprigging is that you can take small amounts of sod and spread it out over a large area where you don't have to buy sod for every square inch of the yard and seed it. You can use less material and still get a good yard in a short amount of time. Anybody done any sprigging? Oh, anybody seen it done? TV maybe? Sports fields? Yeah. Okay.
How long are the sprigs viable?
How long are the sprigs viable? That's a good question. I honestly don't know. It depends on how they're stored, I would assume. You know, if they're set out in the hot sun, I honestly don't know. I would assume it's similar to sod, you know, but I don't know. I know it's interesting that one of the things they found out of that study at the University of Nebraska with the buffalo grass sprigs is that if they harvested them, I think they said after June 21st, and then planted them, they didn't have any growth on those buffalo grass sprigs, but they left them lay there, and then next year they had lots of buffalo grass. And I don't know if they figured out, I don't know if it was seed that came back or the sprigs survived and grew. That was just an anecdote that they said to me one time when I was up there, and that was last year or two, so we'll see what they do up there.
How's Bermuda grass seed spread? It's smaller than bluegrass. Same thing as broadcast spreader. Would we do it a similar way if we were to seed?
Yeah, the question is how would we seed Bermuda grass? Probably with a drop spreader or even the cyclone spreader if you got it real low to the ground and very carefully. Sometimes people will mix in with mill organite or some other fertilizer carrier and kind of fling it around, but definitely not on a windy day. Yep. Sand, yeah, dry sand's a good way. Thank you. So zoysia grass. So, pardon me. That's all right. So zoysia grass both has stolons and rhizomes like Bermuda grass. Stiff leaf, coarse textured, so much stiffer leaves than Bermuda grass. Has that roll of vernation, and then having those hairs on the leaves, and then obviously it's probably going to have a thatch problem. I mean, just be aware of that. So if you got customers that have zoysia grass, they need to be on a thatch management program. So power raking every couple of years, every year. How often do you guys recommend power raking, or how often do you guys been doing it? I'd say at least every couple of years.
Yeah, aeration every year.
Aerate every year and power rake every couple of years. Get that thatch out of there.
Make sure they mow as short as they possibly can and take it away in the spring.
In the springtime, first mowing of the year, mow it real short and all the clippings away. Okay, good points. Okay, really there's only one variety of zoysia grass around here, and that's Meyer. If we get farther south, we can grow a seeded type called Zenith. I got a guy over in Overland Park who's trying to grow some seeded zoysia in his yard, so we'll see how well it does. Usually it gets some winter damage in this part of Kansas, but we've had some pretty nice mild winters for the last few years. So I haven't seen it winter damage, but it's possible. Here's the photograph, and that's really, really dark of zoysia grass. But you can see there's one little hair there, one little hair there, one little hair there. So it's not covered with hair, but there are hairs on the leaf surface of zoysia grass. Okay. So buffalo grass. Buffalo grass, again, this is a little bit washed out, but when you go back and look at the presentation online, YouTube, or whatever, if you look at photographs in those books, you'll see all the fuzz on these buffalo grass leaves. They are extremely hairy. I mean, they're hairy like my arm hairy. They're very hairy, and that hair is an adaptation. An adaptation to avoid drought or heat stress, water stress. The hair, prevents the wind from blowing right across the surface of the leaf and causing the leaf to lose too much water. And that's why you see a lot of these warm season plants have those hairs to prevent the wind from blowing right across the surface of the leaf. What's unique about buffalo grass is that it is separate male and female plants. We found that burr. Yeah. So separate male plants and separate female plants. So when you look at buffalo grass growing, you'll see all these what look like seed heads sticking out above the turfgrass canopy, and a lot of people will think that, like, oh wow, cool, look at all the buffalo grass seed, and they'll gather it all up and they'll try to grow more buffalo grass seed or more buffalo grass from that seed. Those are not buffalo grass seed heads; those are actually male buffalo grass flowers. The female flower, which is real close to the ground, this is about soil level right here. The female flower is the one that produces the seed, and so it's really hard to harvest this seed and get it to grow. But I'll pass this around. You can see it's like a little burr, and this is what the seed looks like when you buy it. And it's $14, $15 a pound. Buffalo grass seed is not cheap, and we talked a little bit about it over in the park. The seeding rate for buffalo grass is 1 to 2 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet, and that's because it's pretty expensive, and it'll spread out if you can afford it or convince the homeowner, if they're interested in seeding buffalo grass. I would seed it higher, 3 to 4 pounds, but tell them, it's going to cost more, but your lawn's going to fill in much faster. It's slow to fill in. It'll spread out like Bermuda grass or zoysia grass, but it won't spread as fast as Bermuda grass. About the same speed as zoysia grass, as far as I'm concerned. It's kind of slow. So I like to seed it heavier, but it's expensive. And then, it's expensive because there's not a lot of people growing it, and there's a cost to harvest that seed. I've been out to western Kansas, how they harvest it. It's pretty cool. They have a regular combine, like you would for combine and wheat, except they have the head on the combine has hard plastic fingers inside of it that actually beat the ground and tear everything all up, and then the head is a big vacuum and just sucks everything all up essentially into the combine. Then they screen out the seed, and they get a lot of debris in there, and then they got to take it back to the plant, screen it to more to get it clean before you buy it. So there's a lot of manual labor involved in producing buffalo grass seed. I digress. Let's move on. So very grayish green color. You'll probably have no problem picking out buffalo grass once you see it in a growing situation. It's all over Overland Park and many of Olathe. It used to be Lenexa's medians. So it's got a grayish green color. The Sprint campus, they have all of their campus planted with 609. Not quite as hardy as Prestige or Legacy. For this part of the area, 609 does really well in Wichita. Doesn't do so good in Kansas City, so they made a mistake there, but they didn't ask me. I wasn't here then. So legacy and prestige. So back to we talked about the vegetative establishment of Bermuda grass. Same type of thing with buffalo grass. The best looking buffalo grasses with the darkest green color, the densest growth, are going to be only from vegetative. You can't get seed. So legacy, prestige, and 609 are some of the best looking buffalo grasses. They have that darkest green color, but you can only buy plugs of them or buy sod of those. Okay. Then if we wanted to buy seed, we get Sharps Approved, Tatanka, Cody, Sharpshooter. The other difference is when we buy these vegetative ones, Legacy, Prestige, Prairie 609, those are female-only varieties. So they don't have that male seed head. Okay, so that makes them desirable in some respects because then it goes, oh, okay, this looks like turfgrass. I don't see those male flowers sticking out, ruining the uniformity of my turfgrass. Where if you're buying seed and planting seed, they have female plants and male plants, so you get all those seed heads. Okay. Cartoon picture of buffalo grass. There's the burr seed. The burrs are real close to the ground. There's a very current picture of buffalo grass growing somewhere along the sidewalk. But last wrap-up slide here. So if we look at the differences between the grasses. So tall fescue compared to Kentucky bluegrass. Tall fescue is rolled. Kentucky bluegrass is going to be folded. Tall fescue is a bunch type. Kentucky bluegrass is going to be rhizomatous. Tall fescue has pointed leaf tip, coarse veins, no midrib, and Kentucky bluegrass has that boat-shaped leaf tip and the midrib and not the coarse veins on top of the surface. Okay. So if we looked at perennial rye and Kentucky bluegrass, perennial rye is going to be folded like the Kentucky bluegrass, but perennial rye is going to be a bunch type grass and not have the pointed leaf or boat-shaped leaf tip like Kentucky bluegrass does. Poa trivialis, comparing them to all three of them. Poa trivialis is going to be folded and have stolons. Going to be a finer color or finer texture and a lighter green color than tall fescue. And it's going to have that boat-shaped leaf tip. Comparing the two, Bermuda and zoysia again, buffalo grass, like I said, I don't think you're going to have a problem picking it out. It is very hairy, the leaves are generally longer, very grayish green color, has stolons and does not have rhizomes. So Bermuda and zoysia grass, they both have rhizomes and stolons, so those kind of cancel each other out. The Bermuda grass does not have hairs on the leaves and has that single pointed shape all the way down in a V pattern, where the zoysia grass has a few hairs on the leaves and then has that, silo shape pattern straight up with the point on top, and then the difference in vernation between the zoysia and Bermuda. But like I said, I have a hard time peeling those open and taking a look at it, the vernation of those grasses as well. Okay.